After the divorce, I finally bought the house she said I'd never afford. Part 1. The marriage that emptied him. For nearly 8 years, Ethan Walker believed that love was something measured by sacrifice. Not grand romantic gestures. Not flowers, gifts, or dramatic declarations. To Ethan, love meant waking up before sunrise and returning home long after dark. It meant carrying responsibilities without complaint, absorbing pressure without burdening the person you cared about, and quietly placing someone else's happiness ahead of your own. When he married Sophia Bennett, he had genuinely thought they were building a future together. He wasn't a wealthy man. He hadn't come from privilege. Every achievement in his life had been earned through persistence, discipline, and countless hours of hard work. Yet none of that had ever bothered him because he possessed something he considered far more valuable than money. He had purpose. He had ambition. Most importantly, he had someone he wanted to share his future with. Their early years together had been filled with optimism. They rented a modest apartment in Shanghai, one of the many countless residential towers stretching toward the sky like monuments to endless ambition. The apartment wasn't large. The furniture wasn't luxurious. Yet Ethan remembered feeling proud every time he unlocked the front door. It was theirs, or at least he had believed it was. Back then, Sophia would sit beside him on their small balcony at night, talking excitedly about the future. She spoke about owning a beautiful house one day, traveling the world, building a successful life together, and raising children in comfort. Ethan listened to every dream. Then he quietly transformed those dreams into goals. While Sophia imagined the destination, Ethan focused on the road required to reach it. He worked as a project manager for a rapidly expanding construction company. The position paid well enough, but the workload was relentless. Deadlines constantly loomed overhead. Clients demanded impossible results. Emergencies appeared at all hours. Weekends often disappeared beneath paperwork and site inspections. Yet whenever exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, Ethan reminded himself why he was doing it. He wasn't simply working. He was building their future. The promotion he pursued wasn't for himself. The overtime wasn't for himself. The bonuses he chased weren't for himself. Everything had a purpose. Everything was for them. As the years passed, however, something subtle began changing within the marriage. The transformation happened so gradually that Ethan didn't immediately recognize it. At first, Sophia's request seemed harmless. A designer handbag she claimed would help her professional image. A luxury vacation because all her friends were traveling overseas. A new phone because her current model was no longer fashionable. Expensive dinners. Exclusive memberships. Weekend shopping trips. Individually, none of those things seemed unreasonable. Together, they became a financial black hole. Whenever Ethan suggested saving more aggressively for a house, Sophia would promise she understood. Then another expense would appear. And another. And another. Somehow the future they had once planned together always seemed to move further away. Meanwhile, Ethan continued sacrificing. He stopped buying things for himself. He postponed hobbies, ignored vacations, skipped opportunities. His wardrobe gradually became outdated because he refused to spend money replacing clothes that still functioned. His old watch remained on his wrist long after most people would have upgraded. His car accumulated years and mileage. Yet he never complained, because every sacrifice brought them closer to their dream. Or so he thought. The first crack appeared during their 4th year of marriage. A name began surfacing repeatedly in conversations. Daniel Carter, Sophia's first love. At first, Ethan paid little attention. Everyone has a past. Everyone has former relationships. The existence of an ex-boyfriend wasn't a threat. What unsettled him was the way Sophia spoke about Daniel. There was a warmth in her voice that Ethan hadn't heard directed toward him in a very long time. Whenever Daniel's name appeared, she became noticeably more animated. Her eyes brightened. Her posture relaxed. Her smile widened. Sometimes she would spend entire evenings talking about him. How talented he was. How intelligent he was. How ambitious he was. How misunderstood he was. The conversations left Ethan with an uncomfortable feeling he struggled to explain. It wasn't jealousy. It was something deeper. A growing realization that his wife seemed more emotionally invested in another man's future than her own husband's. When Daniel returned to China after years abroad, the situation escalated rapidly. At first, Sophia claimed they were simply reconnecting as old friends. Then she mentioned helping him adjust. Then helping him network. Then helping him launch a business venture. Each explanation sounded reasonable when viewed individually. But together they formed a pattern Ethan couldn't ignore. Daniel seemed to occupy an increasingly large portion of Sophia's attention. One evening, Ethan arrived home after an exhausting 14-hour workday. A major project had encountered complications, forcing him to spend hours resolving issues between contractors and investors. By the time he entered the apartment, his shoulders ached and his mind felt numb. The apartment lights were off. Dinner wasn't prepared. Sophia wasn't home. Assuming she was still at work, Ethan ordered takeout and sat at the dining table to review household expenses. That simple task changed everything. At first, he thought he was misreading the figures. Several transactions seemed unusually large. Confused, he opened their banking records. Then his stomach dropped. Transfer after transfer appeared on the screen. Thousands of dollars. Repeated over multiple months. The recipient's name was impossible to mistake. Daniel Carter. For several moments, Ethan simply stared. The apartment was completely silent. The only sound came from the distant hum of traffic beyond the windows. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Years of disciplined saving. Years of sacrifices. Years of careful financial planning. And thousands upon thousands of dollars had quietly vanished into another man's pockets. Without his knowledge. Without his permission. Without even a conversation. When Sophia finally returned home later that evening, she seemed surprised to find him waiting. Ethan. He turned the laptop screen toward her. The color drained slightly from her face. Neither spoke immediately. The silence stretched between them. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Eventually, Ethan asked a simple question. How long? Sophia crossed her arms defensively. He needed help. The answer stunned him. Not because of what she said. Because she didn't deny it. There was no apology. No guilt. No explanation. Only justification. You gave him our savings. He'll pay it back. When? She hesitated. I don't know. Ethan laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes disappointment becomes too large for anger. You didn't even ask me. Sophia rolled her eyes. The gesture hurt more than the transfers themselves. You would have said no. The statement hung in the air. Cold and sharp. Because she was right. He would have said no. Not because he hated Daniel. But because that money represented years of sacrifice. Years of delayed dreams. Years of exhausting labor. Money intended for their future home, their future family, their future security. Sophia had given it away as though none of those things mattered. Over the following months, Ethan discovered the transfers weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger pattern. Daniel constantly needed something. Investment, advice, emotional support, connections, encouragement, financial assistance. And Sophia was always there, always available, always eager. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself receiving less and less of her attention. Their conversations grew shorter. Their dinners became quieter. Their marriage felt increasingly hollow. Yet despite everything, Ethan still tried to save it. He suggested counseling, date nights, vacations, meaningful conversations. Sophia dismissed every effort. According to her, the real issue was money. They didn't have enough. Their apartment wasn't big enough. Their lifestyle wasn't luxurious enough. Their progress wasn't fast enough. No matter how hard Ethan worked, it was never sufficient. Then came the dinner that changed everything. Several mutual friends had gathered at an upscale restaurant to celebrate a recent promotion one of them had received. Conversation flowed easily. Wine glasses clinked. Laughter filled the private dining room. Eventually, the discussion shifted toward real estate. Several couples had recently purchased homes. Others were planning to buy soon. The topic naturally interested Ethan. Despite all the setbacks, he still dreamed of owning a house one day. A real home, not an apartment, not a rental. A place that belonged entirely to him and his family. So he mentioned it. We've been saving, he said with a smile. Hopefully we'll buy a house in a couple years. Before anyone could respond, Sophia laughed. The sound wasn't playful. It wasn't affectionate. It was mocking. The table fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Everyone looked toward her. Sophia shook her head. Ethan is always dreaming. Awkward smiles appeared around the table. Someone attempted to change the subject. She continued anyway. He thinks he can buy a house in this market. More uncomfortable silence. Then she delivered the sentence Ethan would remember for years. A house like that, please. She laughed again. Maybe in another lifetime. No one knew what to say. The humiliation settled over the table like a heavy fog. Ethan forced a smile and pretended it didn't matter. But inside, something cracked. Not because she doubted his finances. Not because she questioned his goals. Because she had publicly ridiculed him. The man sacrificing everything for their future. The man funding their lifestyle. The man carrying nearly every responsibility in the marriage. And she had done it without a second thought. That night, Ethan lay awake staring at the darkness above their bed. Sophia slept peacefully beside him. For hours, he replayed the evening. The laughter. The dismissive tone. The complete absence of respect. Then, for the first time in 8 years, he asked himself a question he had spent years avoiding. What exactly was he receiving in return for everything he gave? The answer frightened him. Because no matter how honestly he evaluated the marriage, he kept arriving at the same conclusion. Very little. Months later, another discovery shattered whatever hope remained. Sophia wasn't merely sending Daniel money. She was spending enormous amounts of time with him. Private lunches, private dinners, weekend meetings, long phone calls, messages at all hours. Every explanation sounded innocent when viewed separately. Together, they painted a picture Ethan could no longer ignore. Perhaps there was no physical affair. Perhaps there never had been. Yet emotional betrayal can wound just as deeply. The affection, the admiration, the support, the loyalty, everything a husband should have received from his wife was being poured into another man. And that man gave almost nothing back except endless demands. One rainy evening, Ethan sat alone in his car outside their apartment building, watching water slide down the windshield in silver streams. For nearly an hour he remained there, thinking, reflecting, finally confronting a truth he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. He wasn't losing his marriage. The marriage had already been lost. He had simply been the last person still trying to save it. And as the rain continued falling across the city lights of Shanghai, Ethan felt something unexpected emerge from beneath years of disappointment. Not grief, not anger, not heartbreak, acceptance. Because for the first time, he understood that some burdens become so heavy they eventually stop being relationships altogether. They become prisons. And once he recognized the bars surrounding him, he could no longer pretend he was free. Part 2. Freedom is cheaper than marriage. The divorce happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. There were no dramatic confrontations, no desperate attempts to reconcile, no tearful promises to change. By the time the paperwork reached Ethan Walker's hands, the marriage had already died long ago. The legal process merely formalized what reality had established months earlier. Sophia seemed surprised by how smoothly everything proceeded. Perhaps she had expected resistance. Perhaps she believed Ethan would beg her to stay. For years she had grown accustomed to a version of him that endured everything without complaint. A man who absorbed disappointment, sacrificed endlessly, and continued carrying burdens long after most people would have put them down. She mistook patience for dependence. She mistook loyalty for weakness. Most importantly, she mistook his willingness to fight for the marriage as proof that he could never walk away. The morning they finalized the divorce, Sophia studied him across the conference room table with visible confusion. The lawyers exchanged documents. Signatures were placed where required. Pages were turned. Formalities were completed. Ethan remained calm throughout the entire process. Not cold, not bitter, simply calm. That calmness unsettled her more than anger ever could. When the final signature was finished, Sophia finally asked the question she had apparently been carrying all morning. That's it. Ethan looked up. What do you mean? You're really not going to fight for us? For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Ethan gave a small, tired smile. I've been fighting for us for 8 years. The answer ended the conversation. Because there was nothing left to argue about. The truth was too obvious. For years he had been the one making sacrifices. The one working overtime. The one compromising. The one carrying responsibilities. The one trying to preserve a relationship that only seemed to matter when it benefited someone else. Eventually, even the strongest person reaches a point where continuing becomes more painful than leaving. Ethan had reached that point long before the divorce papers arrived. Walking out of the building that day felt strangely surreal. He expected heartbreak, expected grief, expected some overwhelming sense of loss. Instead, he felt lighter. The sensation was so unfamiliar that it almost frightened him. For years he had carried constant stress like a second skin. He had become so accustomed to it that he no longer noticed its weight. Only after setting it down did he realize how heavy it had been. That evening he returned to his apartment and sat quietly in the living room. No arguments waited for him. No criticism. No demands. No complaints. No expensive purchases suddenly appearing on credit card statements. No conversations revolving around Daniel Carter's latest crisis. The apartment was silent. Peacefully silent. For the first time in nearly a decade, Ethan experienced something he had forgotten existed. Relief. The following months revealed a reality that shocked him far more than the divorce itself. His finances changed dramatically. At first he assumed it was a mistake. 1 month after the divorce, Ethan reviewed his budget. Then he reviewed it again. And then a third time. The numbers simply didn't make sense. Or rather, they made too much sense. For years he had believed housing prices were rising faster than he could save. For years he had believed his income wasn't high enough. For years he had accepted Sophia's narrative that they simply couldn't afford the future they wanted. Now the truth became impossible to ignore. His income had never been the problem. The problem was where the money had been going. Without Sophia's luxury purchases, designer handbags, impulsive spending habits, expensive social activities, financial support for Daniel, and endless lifestyle upgrades, Ethan suddenly found himself accumulating savings at an astonishing rate. The difference wasn't small. It was enormous. Every month, his account balance grew faster than it had during entire years of marriage. The realization left him sitting silently in front of his banking app one evening, staring at the numbers. A strange mixture of emotions washed through him. Part anger, part disbelief, part liberation. For years he had blamed himself for not progressing faster. Now he realized he had been carrying the financial weight of multiple people while being criticized for not running fast enough. It was like discovering he had spent years climbing a mountain while dragging chains behind him. The chains weren't visible until they were gone. His lifestyle also changed in ways that surprised him. After the divorce, Ethan moved into a smaller apartment. Most people assumed it represented a downgrade. To Ethan, it felt like freedom. The apartment was modern, comfortable, and efficient. More importantly, every item inside existed because he wanted it there. No unnecessary luxury purchases. No decorations chosen solely to impress strangers. No expensive furniture purchased for appearances. Everything served a purpose. The simplicity brought a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Gradually, other aspects of his life improved as well. He began exercising regularly again. Not because he was trying to impress anyone, because he genuinely enjoyed it. Years of stress had left him exhausted and out of shape. Now he found himself waking early for morning runs along the riverside before work. Each passing week seemed to restore a little more energy, a little more confidence, and a little more of the person he used to be. Friends noticed the transformation. Coworkers noticed it. Even his family commented on it. "You seem happier," his older sister observed one evening. Ethan considered the statement carefully, then nodded. "I think I am." What surprised him most wasn't the happiness. It was how ordinary happiness felt once he stopped living under constant pressure. He had spent so many years surviving that he had forgotten what living actually felt like. Meanwhile, his career flourished. Without the emotional exhaustion draining his energy every day, Ethan became sharper, more focused, more ambitious. Projects that once felt overwhelming now seemed manageable. Problems that once consumed entire evenings were solved efficiently. His supervisors noticed immediately. Within a year, Ethan received a promotion. Then another. His salary increased significantly. Major projects were entrusted to him. New opportunities appeared from directions he never expected. For years he had wondered why success always seemed just beyond his reach. Now he understood. It wasn't because he lacked talent. It wasn't because he lacked effort. He had simply been devoting enormous amounts of energy towards sustaining a relationship that constantly depleted him. Once that drain disappeared, his potential finally had room to grow. Ironically, the life Sophia always claimed he couldn't achieve began arriving shortly after she left. The irony wasn't lost on him. Several years passed. The wounds of divorce healed gradually. The anger faded. The disappointment disappeared. Eventually, Sophia became little more than a chapter in his past. Then one evening, an old mutual friend shared unexpected news over dinner. Sophia and Daniel are officially together. Ethan wasn't surprised. If anything, he wondered why it had taken so long. The friend hesitated before continuing. Things aren't going very well, though. Ethan raised an eyebrow. The explanation that followed felt strangely familiar. Daniel's business still struggled. Financial problems continued. Investments had produced little return. Sophia was supporting him financially, paying expenses, covering emergencies, helping solve crisis after crisis. The pattern hadn't changed. Only the person carrying the burden had changed. As Ethan listened, an unexpected feeling emerged. Not satisfaction, not revenge, gratitude. Because hearing that story reminded him how far he had come. The life he once viewed as normal now sounded exhausting. He finished dinner, said goodbye to his friend, and walked home through the evening lights of Shanghai. The city stretched endlessly around him. Busy, alive, full of possibilities. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt completely unburdened. And once a person learns how light life can feel without unnecessary weight, they rarely volunteer to carry it again. Part 3. The house she said he'd never afford. 3 years after the divorce, Ethan stood in front of a massive glass window overlooking the Shanghai skyline and reflected on how dramatically life could change. The city spread beneath him like a sea of lights and steel. Towering skyscrapers pierced the clouds. Traffic moved through illuminated streets like glowing rivers. Construction cranes marked the locations of future developments. Everywhere he looked, the city represented growth, expansion, possibility. And for the first time, Ethan felt as though his own life was moving in the same direction. His career had exceeded every expectation. The promotions continued. His responsibilities expanded. Investment opportunities appeared. Careful financial planning and disciplined saving transformed years of hard work into genuine wealth. Not overnight. Not through luck. Through consistency. The same consistency that had carried him through difficult years. The difference was that now he was building his own future instead of financing someone else's. One rainy Saturday morning, Ethan received a message from a real estate consultant he had spoken with months earlier. A newly completed luxury residential community had officially opened sales. The project occupied one of the most desirable riverfront locations in Shanghai. Beautiful views, excellent schools, private gardens, premium amenities. The kind of neighborhood many people dreamed about, but few could actually afford. Normally, Ethan would have ignored such marketing messages. This time he didn't. Something compelled him to schedule a viewing. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps ambition, perhaps something deeper. A dream that had quietly survived despite everything. The following afternoon, Ethan drove to the development. As his car approached the property, he immediately understood why demand was so high. The community resembled a private oasis within the city. Elegant architecture blended with carefully designed landscaping. Tree-lined pathways wound through gardens. Water features reflected sunlight like polished mirrors. Families walked through open spaces while children laughed near playgrounds. Everything conveyed stability. Success. Home. The word lingered in Ethan's mind. Home. Not an apartment. Not a temporary residence. A home. The consultant greeted him warmly before beginning the tour. They visited several properties, each impressive in its own way. Yet one particular house immediately captured Ethan's attention. The moment he stepped through the front entrance, he felt something unusual, a sense of belonging. The house was spacious without being excessive. Sunlight poured through enormous floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating elegant interiors and open living spaces. The upper level overlooked a beautifully landscaped courtyard. A large balcony provided stunning views of the river and skyline beyond. The design balanced luxury with comfort, sophisticated without feeling cold, beautiful without feeling pretentious. As Ethan walked from room to room, he found himself imagining a future he had once considered impossible. Family gatherings, quiet weekends, holiday celebrations, a life built within these walls. Years earlier, he had shared a similar dream with Sophia. Years earlier, she had laughed. The memory returned unexpectedly. He could still hear her voice, still hear the amusement, still remember the dismissive smile. A house like that, maybe in another lifetime. Back then the comment had hurt. Now it felt distant, almost irrelevant, because reality had moved far beyond her opinion. The consultant eventually guided him into a private office to discuss purchasing options. Detailed brochures covered the desk. Price estimates, mortgage structures, payment plans, investment projections. The consultant spoke confidently, explaining available financing arrangements designed for high-value properties. Ethan listened politely, then interrupted. "I'll be purchasing outright." The consultant stopped speaking. For a moment, he simply blinked. "I'm sorry, I'll be paying in full." Silence filled the office. The consultant clearly hadn't expected that response. Many successful buyers required financing for properties of this value. Paying entirely in cash was uncommon. Ethan remained calm. Inside, however, emotions were stirring. Not pride, not arrogance. Something quieter. Something more meaningful. Validation. Not validation from others. Validation from himself. Every overtime shift. Every difficult project. Every sacrifice. Every lonely night after the divorce. Every careful financial decision. All of it had contributed to this moment. A week later, the transaction was finalized. Stacks of legal documents covered the conference table. Signatures were completed. Funds transferred. Ownership established. When the final document was handed across the table, Ethan became the official owner of the house Sophia once claimed he could never afford. The significance of that moment had very little to do with money. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning some imaginary competition against the past. The house represented something far greater. Freedom. The tangible result of years spent investing in himself rather than carrying others. That evening, Ethan stood alone in his new living room. The house was empty. No furniture yet. No decorations. No signs of life. Yet it already felt more peaceful than the marriage he had spent 8 years trying to save. Sunset painted golden patterns across the floor. The city lights gradually appeared beyond the windows. And as Ethan looked around the home that now belonged entirely to him, he realized something profound. Sophia had never been wrong about one thing. The version of Ethan she knew probably couldn't have afforded this house. That man was exhausted, overburdened, financially drained, emotionally depleted. But she never understood that his limitations weren't his own. They were the result of carrying far more weight than anyone should. Once that burden disappeared, so did the limits she believed defined him. Standing in the center of his new home, Ethan smiled quietly to himself. Because after years of funding someone else's dreams while postponing his own, he had finally arrived at the future he once imagined. And this time, nobody could laugh it away. Part 4. The Reunion. Life has a peculiar way of bringing people back into our path when we least expect it. Not because fate is trying to rekindle old romances. Not because unfinished feelings remain. Sometimes life simply wants to show us how far we've traveled from the person we used to be. Nearly a year after purchasing his riverfront home, Ethan Walker attended one of the largest industry networking galas in Shanghai. The event was hosted jointly by several major corporations, investment groups, and development firms. Invitations were highly selective, reserved primarily for executives, investors, entrepreneurs, and professionals whose influence continued to grow within their respective industries. Years ago, Ethan would never have imagined receiving such an invitation. Back then, he had been consumed by survival, focused entirely on overtime hours, financial pressure, and the exhausting responsibility of holding together a marriage that constantly seemed one disappointment away from collapse. Now things were different. The years following his divorce had transformed nearly every aspect of his life. His career had flourished beyond expectations. The development projects he managed generated substantial profits. Several investments had performed exceptionally well. His professional reputation had steadily grown throughout the industry. Most importantly, the confidence he had gradually rebuilt after the divorce now radiated naturally from him. Not arrogance, not pride, simply confidence born from experience. The confidence of a man who no longer needed external validation to determine his worth. The ballroom occupied the upper floors of a luxury hotel overlooking the Huangpu River. Massive crystal chandeliers illuminated polished marble floors, while floor-to-ceiling windows revealed breathtaking nighttime views of Shanghai's glittering skyline. The atmosphere buzzed with conversation. Business agreements were discussed over wine. Investors exchanged ideas. Executives explored potential partnerships. Laughter drifted through the room. Ethan moved comfortably through various conversations, discussing urban development projects and future investment opportunities. Several years ago, he would have felt intimidated in such an environment. Tonight, he felt completely at ease. At one point, he stood near one of the panoramic windows, speaking with a group of investors, when a familiar voice suddenly reached his ears. A voice he hadn't heard in almost 4 years. Ethan. The sound immediately transported him backward through time. He turned and saw Sophia Bennett. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The years had changed both of them. Yet the differences between those changes were impossible to ignore. Sophia remained beautiful. There was no denying that. However, the vibrant energy that once defined her seemed diminished. Subtle signs of emotional exhaustion lingered around her eyes. Her smile appeared more practiced than genuine. The confident spark that had once made her the center of every room seemed strangely muted. She looked like someone who had spent years carrying disappointments she never expected to encounter. Meanwhile, Ethan had undergone a different transformation. The chronic exhaustion that once haunted him had disappeared. His posture carried quiet confidence. His expression reflected calm rather than stress. The weight that had once burdened him no longer existed. Standing there beneath the soft ballroom lighting, he looked younger than he had during the final years of their marriage despite being older. The contrast wasn't lost on Sophia. He could see it immediately in her eyes. She had expected many things from this reunion. This version of Ethan was clearly not one of them. "Hello, Sophia." His voice remained polite, warm enough to avoid awkwardness, distant enough to maintain boundaries. Sophia smiled uncertainly. "It's been a long time." "It has." For a few moments they exchanged the usual pleasantries. Questions about work, general comments about life, safe topics. Yet beneath every word lingered the awareness of their shared history. Years of marriage, years of disappointment, years of lessons learned. Eventually, the conversation shifted toward professional matters. Sophia mentioned her current position. Ethan spoke briefly about several projects he was managing. At first, she seemed casually interested. Then other attendees began joining the conversation. And with each new introduction, Sophia gradually learned things she clearly hadn't known before. She discovered that Ethan had become one of the most respected project directors within his company. She learned that several investment groups regularly sought his expertise. She heard executives praising his leadership, investors discussing successful ventures he had participated in, industry leaders speaking about him as a peer. The realization visibly affected her, not because Ethan was successful, but because of the scale of that success. Years ago, she had convinced herself that Ethan simply lacked the ability to achieve more. That belief had justified countless criticisms, countless dismissive comments, countless moments when she treated his ambitions as unrealistic dreams. Now reality stood directly in front of her, and reality contradicted every assumption she had ever made. The most uncomfortable revelation arrived later in the evening. A senior executive casually mentioned Ethan's new home during a discussion about real estate investments. The executive laughed. "Honestly, I'm still jealous of that riverfront property you bought." Several people nodded in agreement. Sophia frowned slightly. "What property?" The executive enthusiastically described the luxury residential community, the location, the architecture, the value, the exclusivity. Then he added something else. "The fact that he bought it outright still amazes me." Sophia froze. For a split second, Ethan saw genuine shock flash across her face. A house. Not just any house. The kind of house she once laughed about. The kind of house she said he would never afford. The irony was almost too perfect. For several moments, she remained silent. Then she quietly excused herself. Ethan assumed that would be the end of it. He was wrong. Nearly an hour later, he stepped onto an outdoor terrace overlooking the illuminated river. The cool night air provided welcome relief from the crowded ballroom. He stood alone for several minutes, enjoying the peaceful view. Then footsteps approached behind him. Sophia. Again. This time there was no audience. No business discussions. No distractions. Only two people standing face to face with years of history between them. For a moment neither spoke. Finally Sophia broke the silence. "You look happy." The observation sounded sincere. Ethan considered the statement before nodding. "I am." Sophia looked away toward the river. The city lights reflected in her eyes. "I don't think I've ever seen you this relaxed." Ethan smiled slightly. "Maybe because I finally learned how." The answer carried more meaning than either explicitly acknowledged. A long silence followed. Then Sophia asked quietly, "Do you ever regret it?" "The divorce?" She nodded. Ethan thought carefully before answering. No, the honesty wasn't cruel. It was simply true. Sophia lowered her eyes. That answer clearly hurt. Yet she had asked for honesty, and honesty was what she received. Eventually, she spoke again. Daniel and I aren't together anymore. Ethan wasn't surprised. Something in her expression had already suggested as much. What happened? A bitter smile appeared. The same thing that always happened. The response told him everything he needed to know. Years of financial support. Years of emotional investment. Years of carrying someone else's responsibilities. Eventually, even the most devoted person grows tired. The irony seemed almost tragic. Sophia had spent years criticizing Ethan while repeating the exact same pattern herself. Life possesses a ruthless sense of symmetry. Sometimes we don't understand another person's struggles until we find ourselves living them. For several minutes they talked quietly, not as former spouses, not as enemies, simply as two people reflecting on choices that had shaped their lives. Eventually, Sophia looked at him and asked the question she had been avoiding all evening. Are you seeing someone? Ethan smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that appeared naturally whenever he thought about Olivia Hart. Yes. The single word seemed to strike harder than anything else. Sophia immediately understood. This wasn't a casual relationship. It wasn't temporary. The warmth in his expression revealed far more than his answer. For the first time that evening, genuine regret appeared in her eyes. Not merely regret over the divorce. Regret over everything. The missed opportunities. The misplaced priorities. The years she spent taking him for granted. Perhaps she finally understood what she had lost. Perhaps she finally recognized the value of the man she once dismissed. Unfortunately, understanding often arrives after consequences have already become permanent. As the evening drew to a close, Sophia looked at him one final time. I think I made a lot of mistakes. The vulnerability in her voice surprised him. Years ago, she would never have admitted such a thing. Ethan studied her quietly, then nodded. I know. No anger. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just acceptance. The conversation ended there, because some truths don't require elaboration. Moments later, Ethan returned to the ballroom. Sophia remained on the terrace. And as he walked away, he realized something important. The chapter of his life involving Sophia Bennett had finally ended. Not on the day of the divorce. Not when he bought his house. Not when he achieved success. Tonight. Because for the first time, he felt absolutely nothing pulling him backward. Only gratitude for the lessons learned. And excitement for the future ahead. Epilogue. The home he built. 3 years later. The riverfront house looked even more beautiful than the day Ethan first purchased it. Mature trees now shaded portions of the property. Seasonal flowers bloomed throughout the carefully maintained gardens. Warm lights illuminated pathways winding through the courtyard. Every detail reflected years of care and attention. Yet the house's greatest transformation had nothing to do with architecture. It had become a home. A real home. The kind Ethan once dreamed about while sitting in a cramped apartment years earlier. On a pleasant autumn evening, laughter echoed through the house as family and friends gathered for a celebration. The spacious dining room overflowed with conversation. Children raced through hallways. Music drifted softly from hidden speakers. The atmosphere felt warm, comfortable, and alive. At the center of it all stood Ethan, and beside him stood Olivia Hart, his wife, the woman who had entered his life when he least expected it. Unlike his previous marriage, their relationship had never been built upon sacrifice flowing in only one direction. They supported each other, respected each other, encouraged each other. Neither carried the other. Instead, they walked forward together. The difference transformed everything. Earlier that year, they had welcomed their first child, a daughter named Charlotte. Now, as Ethan held the sleepy toddler in his arms, he found himself reflecting on the long journey that had brought him here. Years ago, he thought success meant working harder, sacrificing more, giving more, enduring more. Life eventually taught him a different lesson. Success isn't about how much weight you can carry. It's about carrying the right weight. The responsibilities that matter. The people who value your effort. The dreams worth pursuing. Everything else eventually becomes an anchor. As evening settled over Shanghai, Ethan stepped onto the balcony overlooking the river. And standing there surrounded by love, peace, and the family he had built with his own hands, he knew with absolute certainty that he would never trade it for anything in the world.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more manhwa style stories. Comment your favorite moment.